May
The route is clear. We
1951,
move through here.
a television
What about the
studio in New
guards?
York City.
Distracted. We
The
slip
cameras
past.
are live,
Good.
the
And
lights
the
are
exit?
bright,
This way.
and sitting
We're
at the
set.
witness
Let's
table,
go.
visible to
The
30
footage
million
looks
Americans
promising.
watching at
Good.
home,
We need to
is
get to
Frank
the meeting.
Costello,
We'll process
the
the film
Prime
right
Minister
away.
of the Underworld,
The car is waiting around
the
the
most
corner.
politically
Let's go,
connected
gentlemen.
organized crime figure in the
My
country.
fellow Americans, we
A
must
man
clean
who
up
has spent
Washington.
30 years
The crime syndicates
carefully
have
avoiding
infiltrated our
exactly this
government.
kind of
We need a
visibility.
crime buster now.
The cameras are pointed at his
Let's
hands
take back
because
our
his
capital.
lawyers have
Mr.
negotiated
Kefauver,
that
what
his
about your
face
ties to
will
Frank
not be
Costello?
shown.
I have no comment
So
on that.
America watches the
And Meyer
hands of
Lansky,
the
the
most
paper links you.
powerful man
Lies
in
and
the American
smears. You have no
underworld
proof.
fidget
The
with a
public
glass of
deserves
water,
answers.
while Senator Estes Kefauver
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
asks him questions
Please be
he
seated.
does not want to answer.
Thank you. I am here to
The
testify.
hearing is a sensation.
We are ready.
Nothing like it has
Proceed.
happened on American television before. The combination of live testimony, organized crime, powerful politicians, and the intimate access of the camera into a world that had previously existed only in newspaper headlines and whispered conversations has produced something that stops the country. Bars and restaurants are packed with people watching. Factories install televisions so workers can follow the testimony during breaks. Schools dismiss early. A medium that has been in most American homes for less than 5 years has just demonstrated, definitively, that it can reshape public consciousness in real time. Frank Costello sweats on camera. His hands betray him. His testimony is evasive, and his evasions are visible to 30 million people simultaneously. By the time he walks out of the hearing room, the damage is done. His public exposure has made him vulnerable in ways that 30 years of careful management had prevented. The aura of invulnerability that surrounded him is gone. He will survive for another 2 decades. But the Frank Costello of before May 1951 and the Frank Costello of after are different people. The hearings did that. Now consider what did not happen in that hearing room. Consider the name that was called and produced a witness who gave almost nothing. Consider the specific way that one person, among all the people Kefauver wanted to expose, managed to appear, testify briefly, and walk away without the kind of damage that destroyed the men around him. Consider why the most financially significant figure in the American underworld, the man whose name appeared in more investigative files and more informant reports and more financial analyses than any other single person, somehow came through the most public and most damaging government investigation of organized crime in American history, essentially intact. That person was Meyer Lansky. The Kefauver Committee, formerly the Special Committee to Investigate Organized Crime in Interstate Commerce, was Senator Estes Kefauver's singular achievement and his vehicle for the presidential ambitions that would ultimately be frustrated. Kefauver was a Democrat from Tennessee, an unlikely crusader against organized crime, given that the Democratic political machine in many American cities had deep and documented relationships with exactly the people he was investigating. But Kefauver understood something that the other senators did not, which was that organized crime had become, by 1950, a political liability rather than a political asset. The public's tolerance for the visible presence of the mob in American life had shifted. Television was about to make that shift permanent, and the senator who positioned himself as the crusader against this specific enemy would have a platform unlike anything available in American political life at that moment. The committee began its work in 1950 and ran through 1951, taking testimony in multiple cities, covering the full geography of organized crime in America. New York, Chicago, Miami, New Orleans, Kansas City, Las Vegas. Everywhere the syndicate operated, Kefauver's investigators went first, and his cameras followed. The televised hearings were the culmination of a process that had already produced extensive documentary evidence about the structure and operations of organized crime in America. Evidence gathered through months of investigation, informant interviews, and financial analysis before a single camera was turned on. What the investigation found, in its documentary phase before the television spectacle, was exactly what any serious investigator of organized crime would have expected to find. The structure of the syndicate, the territorial arrangements, the political connections, the financial flows. And at the center of the financial flows, the name that appeared more consistently than any other, connecting the operations of multiple families and multiple territories through a common financial architecture. Meyer Lansky. Kefauver's investigators knew who Meyer Lansky was. They had his FBI file, which was substantial. They had informant testimony placing him at the center of multiple operations. They had financial analysis suggesting that the offshore architecture through which syndicate money moved had been designed and managed by, or under, his direction. He was, from the investigative perspective, the most important single target the committee had identified. Not the most famous, not the most dramatic, but the most important, in the sense that understanding him was necessary for understanding how the whole system worked. And yet what happened when the Kefauver Committee turned its attention to Meyer Lansky is one of the most revealing episodes in the entire history of American law enforcement's engagement with organized crime. It is the episode that best illustrates why Meyer Lansky survived when everyone else fell. Why the senator who destroyed Frank Costello on live television, who humiliated mob boss after mob boss in front of 30 million viewers, who built his political career on the public exposure of exactly the world Meyer Lansky inhabited, never managed to do to Meyer Lansky what he did to everyone else. The first dimension of the explanation is legal. Meyer Lansky arrived at his committee testimony with the most careful legal preparation of anyone who appeared before it. He had lawyers who had studied the committee's investigative methods, who understood exactly what the committee could compel him to say and what it could not, who had prepared him for every question that was likely to be asked, and had structured his responses to every possible follow-up. He was not going to say anything that was not legally required. He was not going to be drawn into the kind of extended conversation that produced the damaging testimony from other witnesses. He was going to answer the specific questions he was legally obligated to answer, and nothing else. This sounds simple. It was not. It required a quality of discipline under pressure that most people, even intelligent and experienced people, cannot sustain in a setting designed specifically to break it. The hearing room was an adversarial environment. The committee's counsel was skilled and aggressive. The public exposure was intense. Other witnesses, men who had spent their careers in difficult situations, had broken down under the pressure or made mistakes they would spend years regretting. Meyer Lansky did not break down. He did not make mistakes. He appeared, answered what he had to answer, and left. The second dimension is what he had and what he did not have. Meyer Lansky did not have a title. He did not have an official position in any criminal organization. He did not have a territory or a family or a documented organizational role. What he had were financial relationships and business arrangements and investment interests that could each be described individually as legitimate without any single description being provably false. The committee was looking for the kingpin, the boss, the person at the top of the organizational chart. Meyer Lansky was not on any organizational chart. He was the person who made the charts possible without appearing on them. The committee's entire investigative framework was built around organizational structures with identifiable leaders. Meyer Lansky operated outside that framework by design. The third dimension is financial. The committee's most powerful tool against organized crime figures was the financial investigation. The gap between visible income and visible spending. The unexplained assets, the money that could not be accounted for. This was the tool that had destroyed Al Capone 20 years earlier, and that the committee hoped to deploy against the current generation of organized crime leadership. Meyer Lansky had spent 20 years specifically building a financial architecture designed to eliminate exactly this gap. His visible income, generated through documented investments and business interests, was sufficient to explain his visible lifestyle. The hundreds of millions in offshore accounts were invisible. There was no gap between what he appeared to earn and what he appeared to spend, because he had built the architecture to ensure that appearance. The fourth dimension is the most human and the most revealing. Meyer Lansky was not dramatic. He was not charismatic in the way that made good television. He was a small, quiet, precise man in a conservative suit who answered questions in complete sentences without visible emotion. Frank Costello was dramatic. His sweating hands, his lawyer's objections, his visible discomfort under the lights, all of it made for compelling television. The committee needed compelling television because compelling television was the mechanism through which it was reshaping public consciousness and advancing the senator's career. Meyer Lansky did not provide compelling television. He provided exactly what the committee did not want, which was a composed, unremarkable, difficult-to-vilify witness who answered questions and gave nothing away. Kefauver understood this problem. His investigators understood this problem. They knew that Meyer Lansky was more important to the actual functioning of organized crime in America than most of the men who were providing dramatic television testimony. But importance and drama were not the same thing, and it was drama that the hearings ran on. A hearing that could not produce a compelling antagonist could not hold the public's attention, and a hearing that could not hold the public's attention was a political failure regardless of what it documented. Meyer Lansky, by being precisely what he was, undramatic and composed and legally unassailable, removed himself from the committee's most powerful weapon. There is an account of a conversation between Senator Kefauver and one of his chief investigators during the committee's preparation for the New York hearings. The investigator, explaining the challenge that Meyer Lansky presented, reportedly said something to the effect that they had everything they needed to know about what he was, but not enough of what they needed to prove it. That the financial architecture was visible in its outlines, but inaccessible in its specifics. That the offshore layer, in particular, presented jurisdictional obstacles that the committee's powers did not extend to overcoming. That the most important person they wanted to expose was, in a specific technical sense, the least exposable. Kefauver reportedly listened and said that they would call him anyway. That his appearing was itself something. That the public seeing his face and hearing his name was worth doing, even if the testimony produced nothing dramatic. Kefauver was right that his appearance was worth doing. He was wrong about what the public would take from it. What the public saw was a small, quiet, ordinary-seeming man who answered questions politely and did not sweat. The Kefauver Committee concluded its work in 1951. Its final report was a substantial document that named names, described organizational structures, and recommended legislative action on multiple fronts. The report established, for the first time in an official public document, the existence of a national organized crime syndicate operating across state lines with a coordinated structure and a coherent leadership. This finding was contested by J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, who famously insisted that no such national syndicate existed, in part because acknowledging its existence would require him to explain why the FBI had not done more about it. But Kefauver's documentation was too thorough to be dismissed, and the political impact of the televised hearings was too significant to be ignored. What the report did not produce, what the hearings did not produce, was the dismantling of the organization. The televised humiliation of Frank Costello damaged Costello personally and politically, but did not damage the organization he was part of. The exposure of the Las Vegas connection between organized crime and casino operations created political pressure, but did not shut down the casinos. The documentation of the offshore financial flows produced recommendations for international banking cooperation that were not implemented for decades. The committee, in short, had been enormously effective as a political and media event and considerably less effective as a law enforcement instrument. It had shown America what the underworld looked like. It had not dismantled the underworld. Meyer Lansky, watching the committee's aftermath from the position he always occupied, which was slightly outside whatever frame everyone else was focused on, drew his own conclusions. The committee had demonstrated that public exposure was the primary weapon available to investigators who could not penetrate his financial architecture. Public exposure worked on men who needed their reputations, who had political relationships that depended on maintaining a certain appearance, who were vulnerable to the pressure of public opinion. It did not work on men who had no reputation to damage, no political relationships to protect, no appearance that required public maintenance. Meyer Lansky had none of those things by design. He was invisible. The committee's primary weapon had nothing to stick to. He also drew conclusions about the offshore architecture. The committee had reached the edge of it and stopped, unable to penetrate further because of the jurisdictional obstacles that the offshore layer was specifically designed to create. The architecture had held under the most intensive public investigation of organized crime in American history. This was the proof of concept he needed. The system worked. In the years after the Kefauver hearings, Meyer Lansky invested further in the offshore layer. He deepened the relationships with Swiss and Bahamian banking institutions. He added additional jurisdictions to the network. He refined the nominee structures and the layering mechanisms. He built on the foundation that had just been tested and found to be solid. The committee that was supposed to expose and dismantling organized crime in America had instead provided him with a full-scale live test of his defensive architecture and confirmed that it was working. Senator Kefauver ran for president in 1952 and again in 1956. He did not win either time. He died in 1963, a senator still, having spent the last decade of his career on causes that never matched the impact of those 14 months of televised hearings in 1950 and 1951. He had, in those 14 months, changed American political culture permanently. He had shown the country what organized crime looked like from the inside. He had humiliated and destroyed the careers of men who thought themselves untouchable. He had built his own career on the most dramatic public exposure of criminality in American history. And he had not touched Meyer Lansky, the man who was more responsible for the financial architecture of organized crime in America than anyone else on his list. The man whose name appeared in every investigative file and every financial analysis. The man who had sat in the hearing room and answered questions politely and given nothing away and walked out exactly as he had walked in. Kefauver knew this. In a rare moment of candor in a 1957 interview, long after the hearings were over and the immediate political impact had faded, he was asked which of the organized crime figures he had investigated he felt he had failed to adequately address. He paused for a long moment before answering. Then he said a name. The name was not Frank Costello, who he had exposed so dramatically on television. Not any of the family bosses who had testified and whose careers had been damaged by the exposure. The name, he said, was Meyer Lansky. He said, in the specific language of a man choosing his words carefully, that he believed Meyer Lansky was more important to the functioning of organized crime in America than any other single individual, and that the committee have not been able to demonstrate that to the public in the way it had demonstrated the roles of others. He said this without visible bitterness, as a professional assessment. Then he moved on to the next question. Meyer Lansky, if he ever read that interview, gave no recorded response. He was, by 1957, deep into the construction of the Havana Empire, managing financial flows of a scale that made the Las Vegas operations look modest. The Senators' war had come and gone. The architecture had held. The system had worked, and Meyer Lansky was already building the next thing. If this story of the most consequential investigative failure in American political history, of the senator who changed the country but could not touch the one man who mattered most, moved you, subscribe to this channel, because the full story of how Meyer Lansky defeated every attempt to expose him spans 50 years and is still not fully understood. Drop a comment. Tell me whether you think Kefauver could have gotten him if he had tried harder, or whether the architecture was simply too well built. And remember this: the best defense is not the one that fights back. It is the one that gives the attacker nothing to hit. Meyer Lansky built that defense. The senator threw everything he had at it. The architecture held. To fully understand what Meyer Lansky did during the Kefauver period, you have to understand what it felt like from the inside of the organization he was part of. The hearings were not an abstraction for the people whose names were being called. They were an existential threat that arrived with almost no warning, and that most of them were not equipped to handle. The problem was the medium. The men who ran the American underworld in 1950 had survived and thrived in a world where the primary risks were physical violence and legal proceedings. They understood both of those risks and had developed sophisticated responses to them. Physical violence you managed through your own capacity for violence and through the relationships and alliances that made attacking you more costly than leaving you alone. Legal proceedings you managed through lawyers and through the corruption of the specific individuals in the legal system who could make proceedings go away or produce favorable outcomes. Both of these were domains where the rules were known and the countermeasures were established. Television was neither of those things. Television was a new kind of threat that nobody in the organization had encountered before, and nobody had developed countermeasures for. It was not a physical threat, and it was not a legal threat in the conventional sense. It was a reputational threat, an identity threat. The specific threat of having your face and your name and your discomfort under questioning broadcast into 30 million American living rooms simultaneously. And the men who ran the American underworld were, in 1951, almost uniformly unprepared for it. Frank Costello had spent 30 years building a reputation for being untouchable. That reputation existed in the world of New York politics and New York criminal life, in the specific community of people who knew who he was and what he was capable of. Television took him out of that community and placed him, suddenly and without preparation, in front of 30 million people who did not know him and were forming their first impressions in real time. His carefully maintained public persona, the legitimate businessman with social connections and charitable contributions and a respectable surface, could not survive the cameras. What the cameras showed was a man sweating through his testimony while his lawyers objected to every third question, and whatever story that persona had been telling for 30 years was contradicted by every second of that footage. Meyer Lansky did not have a public persona to protect. He had spent 30 years specifically avoiding the creation of any public image at all. There was nothing for the cameras to contradict because there was nothing there. No story to undermine, no reputation to damage, no carefully maintained surface that the cameras could penetrate and expose as hollow. Just a small, quiet, unremarkable man who answered questions in complete sentences and gave nothing away. This was not luck. The men who were destroyed by the cameras had been able to maintain their public personas because they operated in environments where the cameras had not yet penetrated. Meyer Lansky had specifically prepared for an environment where cameras would eventually arrive by ensuring that there was nothing worth filming. No title, no territory, no organizational position, no public face that could be turned against him. No gap between the public story and the private reality, because the public story was so sparse and so carefully maintained as to be essentially invulnerable to contradiction. The specific tactics he used during the testimony itself were the product of months of preparation. His lawyers had, in the period before his appearance, reviewed every available account of how other witnesses had fared before the committee. They had analyzed the committee's questioning style, the specific techniques that counsel used to draw witnesses into extended responses that produced useful admissions, the way that follow-up questions were used to exploit the openings created by initial answers. They had prepared Meyer Lansky for every likely question and its likely follow-ups, and had developed response strategies that gave the committee the minimum information required without creating any opening for the extended examination that had damaged others. The preparation showed. Other witnesses had been drawn into long exchanges that produced damaging admissions. Meyer Lansky gave short, complete, legally defensible answers that closed off follow-up rather than opening it. Other witnesses had been rattled by aggressive questioning and had made mistakes under pressure. Meyer Lansky was not rattled. His composure under questioning was noted by committee staff in their internal memoranda as unusual, as suggesting either exceptional self-control or exceptional preparation, or both. It was both. There was also the specific matter of what the committee's investigators had and what they were able to prove. The investigative preparation for the hearing had produced substantial evidence of Meyer Lansky's role in the syndicate's financial architecture. This evidence was in the form of informant testimony, financial analysis, and documentary records gathered from cooperating witnesses and from various legal proceedings that had touched on the offshore financial flows. It was substantial enough to establish that Meyer Lansky was important. It was not sufficient to sustain a criminal prosecution. The committee's counsel knew this going into the hearing. The gap between knowing and proving is the gap that Meyer Lansky had spent 20 years designing his operations to create. The committee had the shape of what he had built. It did not have the inside. It had the architecture diagram with question marks at the critical nodes. It did not have the account numbers and the beneficial ownership documents and the transactional records that would have converted the diagram into a criminal case. Those things were in jurisdictions that the committee could not reach. They were behind legal walls that the committee's authority did not extend to penetrating. After the hearings, as the committee's final report was being assembled, Kefauver's chief investigator wrote an internal memorandum that has since been partially declassified. In it, he describes the problem of Meyer Lansky in terms that are unusually candid for a government document. He writes that the subject presents the most difficult evidentiary challenges of any individual the committee investigated. That the offshore financial architecture, while clearly established in its outlines, is inaccessible in its specifics without international legal cooperation that is not currently available. That the domestic financial evidence, while suggestive, does not meet the standard required for prosecution. That the subject's organizational position, which is central to the syndicate's financial operations, is not represented in any document or testimony in a form that establishes the organizational relationship legally, and that the subject's testimony provided nothing useful. The memorandum concludes with a recommendation that the committee note, in its final report, the importance of international banking cooperation as a law enforcement tool for addressing the offshore dimension of organized crime finance. This recommendation appeared in the final report. It was not acted upon for decades. The legal framework for the kind of international financial cooperation that would have allowed American investigators to penetrate Swiss and Bahamian banking secrecy did not begin to develop until the 1980s, and was not substantially in place until the 1990s and 2000s. By that time, Meyer Lansky had been dead for years, and the specific structures he had built had been through multiple generations of restructuring that made them even harder to trace than they had been in 1951. The irony is complete. The committee that was supposed to expose the architecture of organized crime in America produced a recommendation for the very legislative tool that might have penetrated Meyer Lansky's specific defense. That tool arrived 30 years too late to be used against him. The Senators' war ended. Meyer Lansky walked away from it intact. And the recommendation that might have eventually produced a different outcome sat in a government report, unimplemented, for decades. while the architecture it was designed to address continued to operate and compound and grow. Senator Kefauver's legacy is, by most assessments, a positive one. He forced America to confront the reality of organized crime. He used the emerging power of television journalism to create public accountability for a phenomenon that had previously been managed in private. He built the investigative and legislative foundation on which subsequent anti-organized crime efforts were built. The federal organized crime statutes of the 1960s and 1970s, the more sophisticated investigative tools that followed, the eventual development of international financial cooperation mechanisms, all of these trace their lineage, in part, to the work that Kefauver started. But in the specific contest that this story is about, the contest between the senator who wanted to expose the architect of organized crime finance and the architect who had built his defenses specifically to resist that exposure, the outcome is unambiguous. Kefauver had everything available to him: the investigative resources, the public platform, the political will, the cameras, the 30 million viewers, and he could not do what he needed to do, which was to penetrate an architecture specifically designed to defeat exactly those tools. Meyer Lansky sat in the hearing room. He answered his questions. He walked out. He went back to work. The senator's war came and went. The architecture stood. And the money continued to move through the invisible channels that no senator and no investigator and no 30 million television viewers could see, doing exactly what it had always done, exactly as it had always been designed to do. There is a specific moment in the documented history of the Kefauver hearings that captures the entire dynamic in a single exchange. It is a moment that happened not in the televised public sessions, but in one of the private executive sessions that preceded the public testimony. Sessions where the committee's counsel questioned witnesses without cameras. In one of these sessions, the committee's counsel was pressing Meyer Lansky on a specific financial transaction that investigators believed connected his domestic operations to his offshore accounts. The transaction had been partially traced through multiple jurisdictions before the trail went cold at the edge of the Swiss banking layer. The counsel asked Meyer Lansky directly whether he had any beneficial interest in the specific foreign corporate entity through which investigators believed the transaction had passed. Meyer Lansky, by all accounts, paused before answering. Not the pause of a man searching for a lie, the pause of a man who has been asked a question that he is prepared for and is now delivering the prepared answer with the precise care that the question requires. Then he said, in effect, that he was not aware of holding any beneficial interest in the entity described. The answer was legally accurate. The beneficial interest documentation that would have established the connection existed in the files of the nominee directors who managed the entity. It was not held by Meyer Lansky in a form that created direct personal ownership. The architecture had been specifically constructed so that this question could be answered truthfully in the way that he answered it. The committee's counsel knew this. Meyer Lansky knew the counsel knew this. Both men understood that the question had been asked and answered in a way that was technically truthful and substantively meaningless, and that there was nothing the counsel could do about it within the constraints of the legal framework he was operating in. This is the Kefauver Committee's engagement with Meyer Lansky in miniature. A legally accurate answer that tells you exactly nothing. A witness who is prepared so thoroughly and whose defenses have been so carefully constructed that the standard tools of examination cannot penetrate them. A senator who has the investigative resources and the political platform and the public attention and still cannot get inside the architecture of a man who built that architecture specifically to resist exactly these tools. Kefauver spent the rest of his political career, until his death in 1963, believing that Meyer Lansky was the most important unfinished business of his most important work. He said this in various formulations, in interviews and in private conversations that have since been documented. The senator's war did not end with the senator's victory or the senator's defeat. It ended with the senator's death, with the business unfinished, with the architecture intact, and the man who built it still at work. Meyer Lansky outlived Senator Kefauver by 20 years. He died in 1983, 2 decades after the senator whose committee had been his most serious public challenge, having never been convicted of anything serious, having survived every investigation and every prosecution attempt and every televised exposure, having built and operated the financial architecture of American organized crime for 50 years. The senator fought the war he was equipped to fight. The architecture was built for exactly that war. The architecture won. And the 30 million Americans who watched Frank Costello's hands sweat on their television screens in May 1951 never saw the face of the man who actually mattered most. Meyer Lansky was not compelling television. He was the most important thing the senator never managed to show them. That absence, that invisible center of everything the hearings were ostensibly about, is the fullest expression of what Meyer Lansky built and why he built it. The most powerful person in the room was the one the camera could not find anything interesting to show. The paradox at the heart of the Kefauver story is one that American law enforcement and American political culture has never fully resolved. The tools that work best for public accountability, cameras, televised hearings, public exposure, the court of public opinion, work precisely because they target reputation, because they operate on the specific vulnerability of people who have built public identities that can be damaged by contradiction. They destroy the gap between the public image and the private reality. They are extraordinarily effective against people who have something to protect in the public domain. They are useless against people who have nothing there. Meyer Lansky had nothing there. He had built his entire professional existence on the principle that the public domain was dangerous and that the safest position was the one with no public surface at all. No title, no fame, no reputation requiring maintenance, no public identity that could be damaged by exposure. The camera that destroyed Frank Costello had nothing to destroy when it turned toward Meyer Lansky, because there was nothing visible to destroy. This is the specific genius that Senator Kefauver's investigation revealed, perhaps unintentionally. The most dangerous person in any system is not the most powerful person in the conventional sense. It is the person who has made themselves immune to the specific weapons available to their adversaries. Meyer Lansky had made himself immune to the specific weapons of public exposure and financial investigation that were the most powerful tools the American government had available for addressing organized crime. The senator brought those weapons to bear with maximum force and maximum public attention. The architecture held. The man walked out. The senator died with the business unfinished. The architecture continues.